Ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, good afternoon. Welcome back. I hope you had a great lunch, but this will be always a hard time to keep us awake after lunch. But we have to listen very carefully to our distinguished speakers in the session with the title of Bandung Conference, New Insights or New Perception or Understanding from the panelists here. Since I have no CV of each of the panels, so would you please introduce yourself briefly before you deliver your presentation? So, first is Mr. Darwis Khudori, the next is Mr. Wildan Sena Utama, and then Ms. Naoko Shimizu, and Mr. Jürgen Dinkel. I will give each to speak maximally 15 minutes, and after that we are going to have discussion, a Q&A session for about 30 minutes. Without further ado, I will give the first opportunity to Mr. Darwis Khudori, who is going to share with us about Bandung Conference for the fundamental books. Please, Darwis.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody here. It's okay. Yeah. Yes, it will be hard after lunch to discuss something serious, heavy. Not really. Let us make light things. Well. My name is Darwis Khudori. I'm Indonesian but based in France. I'm architect and historian by training, and the last years I do research on Bandung Conference in French archive. I'm preparing a book on the French archive, the Bandung Conference according to the French archive. Which is very, very, very interesting, because the France government, in fact, followed the trajectory of Bandung Conference since Bogor Conference 55, and then Cairo Conference, and then after Cairo it was in Conakry, and then Belgrade, and then until the end of the Bandung, the failure of the Bandung in 65 in Algeria. So you find this whole archive in diplomatic archive of France. But now what I want to present is the fundamental books of Bandung Conference. Why I think it is necessary to present this, because almost 60 years after the Bandung Conference there are many books written on Bandung Conference, but still there are some mistakes. For example, the most common mistake is that Kwame Nkrumah, Ho Chi Minh, they participated in Bandung Conference while they are not. So why this kind of mistakes continues to produce? Because they don't read the fundamental books, I mean the initial books of the Bandung Conference. And I will try to present what I call a must, the fundamental books to read for those who are interested in Bandung Conference. So yeah. Well, in fact, I wish to introduce 4 notions related to Bandung, what is called Bandung Conference, Bandung Speak, Bandung Era, and Bandung Constellation. But I'm afraid if I go into details of this, will take time. So I will go directly to the bibliography of the Bandung Conference, and maybe I will come back if I have time. Oh. Yeah, okay. Yeah, but it's not so clear. But okay. there are 9 books what I consider as fundamental. The first book was written by an American journalist called Jack Homer Alexander. This book is almost unknown. Why? Because it is not academic book, but it is very interesting. This I consider as the most complete reportage on Bandung Conference. And it was published just 1 month after the Bandung Conference. Written by Jack Homer Alexander, who is a scientist, but converted into journalism and activism. He is an activist of peace, anti-war, etc. in the United States of America. And he came to Bandung to participate in the Bandung Conference as a journalist. And his book is in my opinion, the earliest book on Bandung Conference, which is complete. So his report, I will come back because it is very interesting. I will mention the second book, of course, is Richard Wright, which is very famous. There is not clear. Can I go down there? My PowerPoint. It's too far. Okay, the book is by Jack Homer Alexander. The second is Apadorai, which is the secretariat of the Bandung Conference. Indian delegate was appointed as joint secretariat in Bandung Conference. So he wrote the Bandung Conference and published first time in June 1955 by New Delhi, the Indian Council of World Affairs. And the third one, this is the book mentioned by Professor Mohanty. It's not the first. This is the third publication by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and written by Wildan. And the fourth book is Richard Wright, The Color Carton, which the first edition was in French. And it is called Bandung un milliard et demi d'hommes. And it was published in October 1955. And the following year, the English version was published under the name of The Color Cotton, a report of the Bandung Conference. And then only after that, the book well known among the academics, which was written by Kahim, George Tunan Kahim, mentioned by Professor Manoranjan, the Asian African Conference, Bandung, Indonesia, April 1955. And then after that, 1956, the book by General Carlos Romulo from the Philippines, who wrote The Meaning of Bandung, which was his conference in the United States in the University of North Carolina. And then 1965, so almost 10 years later, the most important book on Bandung Conference by French writer Arthur Comte, who wrote Bandung tout au long de l'histoire. In fact, before the book of Arthur Comte, there was a book already by Odette Guitard, published first time in 1961, but it is more putting Bandung Conference in the trajectory of history. So not really focused on Bandung Conference itself, but the book by Arthur Comte is really focused on the Bandung Conference. And later, 15 years later, the most important book by Ruslan Abdul Ghani, who is the Secretariat General of the Bandung Conference, the Bandung Connection. He wrote a book titled Bandung Connection, Konferensi Asia Afrika di Bandung 1935. This is the first Indonesian edition, and then the second edition in English published in Singapore in 1980, English edition 1981. And the last book just published 7 years ago or 8 years ago by Auyeung Lai who is a part of our working group on history, but finally he cannot come. The Political and Moral Imperatives of the Bandung Conference 1935, the reactions of the US, the UK, and Japan. So I will come back to quote some of this book if I have time. Okay, so I will quote and then I will go back to my computer because I don't have the quotation here. So I have some quotation here, which I consider very interesting. This is better? Yeah. Well, Richard's right. I will quote some of the passage of Richard's right, which is very interesting. The strong point of Richard Wright is a personal account of the Bandung Conference. So it's a kind of novel, a kind of roman from personal point of view. And he made an observation very interesting, for example, of the living condition of the poor of Jakarta at the time. He wrote, I passed those famous canals which the Dutch, for some inexplicable reason, has insisted upon digging here in this hot mothball of a city. I saw a young man squatting upon the bank of the canal, defecting in the broad daylight into the canal's muddy, swirling water. I saw another. Children use the canal for their water closet. Then I saw a young woman washing clothes only a few yards from them. A young girl was bathing. She had a cloth around her middle and she was dipping the water out of the canal and holding the cloth out of her body. She poured the water over her covered breast. A tiny boy was washing his teeth, dipping his toothbrush into the canal. For those who knows Jakarta, it's not really old. I mean, you still find this kind of reality today. This is a very interesting observation of Richard Wright, for example. Romulo is very interesting because he represents the pro-American. He is friends of America, and during the Bandung Conference, he is the defender of American interests. But in this sense, he is also the one who criticized America as well. So I will quote some of his words, which is very interesting. So I quote, this is the word of Carlos Romulo. Why do Americans constantly boast of the superiority of American way of life? It has its advantages and its blessing, no doubt. But what is good for the Americans does not necessarily have to be good for us. Our way of life, which we have had for 2,000 years, may not offer the prosperity of the 200-year-old of United States. But there is something in maturity that cannot be bought with dollars or cheap with chewing gum or dogs and comic strips. Another one. The latest expression of American materialism is not Hollywood. It is the nuclear weapon. Americans think that because they have superiority in this type of weapon of destruction, they can stand alone and need not exert any effort to make friends or win allies. In fact, they are so ready for war, they do not want to talk or enter into any negotiation. They are spoiling for fight. You imagine, this is in 1956 and it's still very relevant today.
why I consider this a fundamental book for Bandung Conference. There's another word from Romulo. The new Asia and Africa, as shown in Bandung, is not taking the identical shape of a new Europe or a new America. Asia and Africa will go their own way, and the great hope of all mankind must be that they will share in a continuing partnership with what is best in America and world. You have time still? Yeah, okay, 1 more minute. What can I offer to you? Interesting passage. No, well, now anecdote, which is very, very interesting anecdote by Ruslan Abdul Ghani. Why the Bandung Conference started at 18th of April. It was planned that the Bandung Conference started at the end of April. But in fact, starting from 24th of April, it's already Ramadan. So there is a risk that the Muslims from Middle East, from Pakistan, from Arabic countries, they will not come. So they put earlier, 1 week earlier, 17th of April. But 17th of April, it was Buddhist great day. So UNU, the Burmese, the Sri Lanka, the Thai, they will not come. So finally, they are forced to decide that it will start at 18th of April. And what is interesting, in what 18th of April, at that time, United States is not favorable for Bandung Conference. So that Ruslan Abdul Ghani was very, very stressed because of the pressure of the international opinions on Bandung Conference. And Sukarno pressed him, gave me input for my speech of the Bandung Conference. So Ruslan Abdul Ghani, who had a good relation with the American embassy, he called the American ambassador at the time, Hugh Cummings, to send him some elements on American civilization, because Ruslan Abdul Ghani remembered that there was something in the history of United States, 18th of April. There was something in the history of American civilization. That's true. Few days later, he got many books from the Embassy of America about American civilization, and he found that 18th of April is the beginning of the war anti-British, the war of independence of the United States of America. So that's why it was the 18th of April is the moment where a young American whose name is Paul Revere, galloping with horse and calling for people to wait, the British army is coming. We have to resist. So what happened? Then Ruslan Abdul Ghani proposed this to Sukarno. Why don't you include this idea of the War of Independence, 18th of April, as a starting of our start? So then Sukarno, if you read the discourse, the speech of Sukarno, 1955, opening speech, you will find this passage. 18th of April, the start of the war of anti-colonialism. And he, of course, as a great orator, he quote the poems of Longfellow. This moment was eternalized by Longfellow, the American poet. And so Sukarno, while giving the speech, he quote the passage of this the very heroic starting war of independence in the United States. And what happened after Sukarno's speech? The ambassador of America, very happy. He came to salute the Ruslan Abdul Ghani, and all the American journalists applaud this moment. So it's a bit of anecdote. I'm sorry I took too much time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pak Darwis. From all the books that you have read, if you have to illustrate in several words, but you have which can help us to memorize. Yeah. What kind of keywords from all the fundamental books that you can share with us?
Yeah, I think the speech of Carlos Romulo is for me is very relevant. It is very interesting that if you read the work of Samir Amin, they give the same, they ask the same question already posed by Carlos Romulo in '55. That is it how did the future of Asia and Africa? If they will follow the way of America, of Europe, this is the question of Samir Amin. If it is possible that there will be a catching up of this country, underdeveloped or developing countries, following the same model of development of United States, of Western world. So this is, I think, the crucial question that's still very relevant today. Thank you.
Thanks, Darwis. I will give now the opportunity to the next speaker, Mr. Wildan Sena Utama, who is going to share about Alisa Suamijoyo and Afro-Asian Solidarity Project. Please, Pak.
So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank the committee to invite me to present my current project. So my research entitled Alisa Suamijoyo and Afro-Asian Solidarity Project. So first, I want to give a brief introduction why I researched on this topic. So the idea of this research appeared because I'm curious with the role of Alisa Suamijoyo in the Bandung Conference. So Alisa Suamijoyo was the Prime Minister of Indonesia who proposed the idea of Bandung Conference. But why Alisa Suamijoyo proposed such an idea, or why Alisa Suamijoyo concerned to build solidarity of Asian and African countries? I think with these two questions we will know why the role of Alisa Suamijoyo is significant to the emergence of the Bandung Conference. So I think we tend to forget the important role of Alisa Suamijoyo to the emergence of the Bandung Conference, because his political contributions was overshadowed by the great names of third world leaders such as Sukarno, Nehru, or Nasser. So Christopher Lee said Bandung was the culmination of an alternative chronology of world events organized by non-Western intellectuals and activists who had been oppressed by colonialism, racism, and class superiority. The predecessors of the Bandung Conference included a series of Pan-African congresses that took place from 1900 to Pan-Asian People Conference held in Nagasaki and Shanghai, and more importantly, the Leagues Against Imperialism Conference at Brussels in 1927, and the Asian Relations Conference at New Delhi in 1947. So the development of Alisa Suamijoyo idea on Afro-Asian solidarity was influenced by these global events. The concerns of Alisa Suamijoyo to form Asian-African solidarity was not only influenced by the Cold War situations or Indonesian non-alignment policy, but it was importantly developed by his political and diplomatic journey that to some extent connected with global events that form the bedrock of the Bandung Conference. So my research examined how the development of Alisa Suamijoyo idea on Afro-Asian solidarity significantly contributes to the emergence of the Bandung Conference. So I will present my presentations on Alisa Suamijoyo political and diplomatic career chronologically. From he was a student in Netherlands in 1920s until he participated at Asian Relations Conference became first Indonesia's ambassador to the US until he participated at Colombo Conference and organized Bogor Conference. So I will discuss every episode on his life that gave him awareness about the importance of Afro-Asian solidarity. So, sorry. Yeah. Oh, God. Yep. So the first experience that contributed to give him a cosmopolitan view and made him aware that the alliance between Asians and Africans anti-colonial movements was important was apparently when he was a student in Netherlands in 1920s. In early 1920s, Ali started to study law in Leiden University. In Netherlands, he joined Perhimpunan Indonesia, the Indonesian student political group that active against Dutch colonialism in Indonesia. On the struggle for independence, the role of PI probably was similar with propaganda movement in Madrid or Vietnam student group in Paris. So these people were expatriate patriot, to borrow Sugarta Bose's term, people who discover their nationness after leaving the motherland. So in 1925, PI began to apply new strategies on its political movement. So to make its struggle more effective and stronger, they concentrated to emphasize its voice in international politics. So PI began to propagandize its anti-colonial visions internationally through making alliance with other revolutionary leaders and organizations, attending conferences and traveling to other countries in Europe. So in August 1926, PI went to Beerville to attend International Democratic Conference for Peace. According to Ali, in that occasion, PI had an opportunity to voicing Indonesian name for the first time in the international forum. So in 1927, PI became Indonesian representative for the Leeds Against Imperialism Conference in Brussels. Sukarno, in his opening speech at Bandung Conference, reminded the pivotal role of the Brussels Conference as a historic moment that was chronologically linked to the Bandung Conference. So the Brussels Conference was a milestone for emerging colonial nations, as it was the first time for leaders of Asia, Africa, America to converge in one place to talking about imperialism and colonialism. Many distinguished and prominent delegates from Asian and African countries came and made first direct contact at Brussels. So it was at Brussels, Hatta from Indonesia for the first time met with Jawaharlal Nehru from India, Lamin Senghor from Senegal, Han Xin Liu from Kuomintang, Hafiz Ramadan Bey from Egypt, Ahmed Mesali from Algeria. So despite Ali not participated in Beerville and Brussels, he learned the importance of Afro-Asian solidarity by his involvement in PI and when he became student in Netherlands. So Ali, like other members of Perhimpunan Indonesia, often went to Paris to build contacts with other Asians and African revolutionaries. He said in his memoir about this experience, the exchange ideas between Indonesian youth and Asians and African youth was helpful and enriched the ideas on struggle to the PI members. From this context, our political belief became more firm. And after Indonesia's independence, Ali Sastroamidjojo always assigned to the positions with regard to international diplomacy. So in 1947, he became one of Indonesia's representatives to attend the Asian Relations Conference in New Delhi. So the Asian Relations Conference, believed by historians, have been significant as a pathway to the Bandung Conference. So there were over 200 delegates representing 28 Asian countries at the Asian Relations Conference. In terms of participants and contents, this conference can be considered as continuity to the Asianist and anti-imperialist movements in the interwar period. So this conference was the first occasion for Asian political leaders to express the primary political dilemma facing new Asian states. So the legacy of this conference brought an opportunity to unify political vision and closer cooperations among Asian countries. In his memoir, Ali Sastro writes that this conference gave him awareness that Indonesia is not standing alone and cannot stand alone. He said, the more important for me and I think for some of us is an opportunity for 10 days to know each other, the leader of Asian and Arab countries. My view about the state of the world, who have been so limited as only seen from Jakarta state alone, is now becoming more widely, so that I can feel that other Asian nations represented in the conference are struggling as well as. So, according to David Kincher, this conference accelerated the process of inter-Asian cooperations that was to give birth to Afro-Asianism. So the performance of unity shown by this conference was probably the conference's most lasting achievement. And the next important phase of Ali that contributes to him to build solidarity among Asian and African countries was when he got a mandate to be the first Indonesian ambassador to the US in 1950. So these new positions increased his diplomatic skill and gave him more responsibility to be involved in international politics. So in addition, these strategic positions facilitated him to expand and build new relations with other Asian and African ambassadors in the US. So he told in his memoir, my relationship with colleagues from Asian and African countries is very well. Representatives of these countries in Washington have not been many. There are only 20. Very few representatives are from Africa, only Egypt, Ethiopia, and Liberia. Good relations between ambassadors from Asia and Africa we build with a meeting once a month, which is held alternately in the residence of each of us. However, Ali Sastro confessed that this process was not run smoothly because the Cold War has influenced some Asian countries to take side between two great powers. So at this moment, Ali also faced the Cold War atmosphere among Asian and African countries in the US, and he preferred to practice independent and active policy to respond to the Cold War. So Indonesia didn't side with the US or Soviet, but at the same time, Indonesia can build relationship freely with anyone. So in 1953, Ali Sastro became the new Prime Minister of Indonesia, replacing Wiloko. He said in these new positions, he could actively participate in international politics more than previous positions as ambassadors. His experience as ambassador so influenced him in viewing the importance of international affairs. His first speech at Parliament underlined the active participation of Indonesia to alleviate the Cold War tension in Asia. He said that although the Korean War had eased, the peace in Asia still could not be felt because the Vietnam War was still raging. With the Cold War intervention in Vietnam, he said now the Cold War was completely moving to Asia. Ali Sastro then declared the idea to build solidarity with other Asian and African countries to strengthen effort toward the world peace. So the active participation of Indonesia to encourage peace, according to him, cannot success if it did not run together with countries that circumstance and positions similar with us. He said, cooperations of Asian and African countries are important because we are convinced that close cooperations between these countries certainly strengthen efforts towards the achievements of everlasting world peace. So in 1954, it was the height of the Cold War tension in Asia. So the Vietnam War seemed to be getting worse and needed any political effort to solve the crisis. So the precarious circumstance in Asia prompted some Asian countries such as India and Indonesia to discuss the possibility to overcome the Vietnam crisis. However, it was not by insistence of Indonesia or Indian efforts, but the initiative taken by the Prime Minister of Ceylon to organize the conference of Asian leaders to discuss such problems. So when Ali Sastroamidjojo received invitations from Kota Lawala to participate at the Colombo conference, Ali answered these invitations with proposed two conditions. The first, in that conference, it did not discuss things that could raise disputes between participants. The second, Indonesia was given opportunity to propose an idea about conducting a similar conference as Colombo, but wider in scope. Kota Lawala then accepted these proposals from Ali Sastroamidjojo. And before Ali left Indonesia to go to Colombo, he said in press release on 26 April 1954 that he emphasized again his idea to hold the Asian Africans Conference. He said, I would propose to discuss the possibility in holding a conference that wider in scope between Asian and African countries. And I hope my proposal would be successful. And I went to the Colombo conference with full of hope our voices from Colombo would receive attention as well. So in the Colombo conference, Vietnam War became the main issues of the conference. And another important issue discussed in there are the problem of colonialism in Africa, human rights and self-determination, and the problem of nuclear weapons. The Colombo powers urged for a non-intervention in their response to the Vietnam War and for the organizations of ASEAN regional operations. So Ali urged ASEAN countries to take more responsibility in the crisis. He said, where do we, the peoples of Asia, stand? Whether we want to be dragged in this dispute that previously done to seize power. On 30 April 1954, Ali proposed the idea of Asian Africans Conference. When Ali presented this idea, he elaborated that the conference would be as a conference similar in nature to the present conference, but wider in scope to include not only countries of Asia, but some countries of Africa as well. His proposal was not received well in first instance. Nehru was skeptical. He said that many problems would have to be overcome to organize such a big conference. Nehru said that if the conference was to achieve a consensus that was prepared in order to make an impact in world affairs, this would be hard to synchronize with the perceptions among the huge members of participants, since there were many diverse opinions. However, Ali Sastroamidjojo didn't retreat with his idea. His persistence and persuasiveness eventually succeeded influencing the belief of other participants to accept his idea. And despite Ali's proposal was accepted at Colombo, but actually other Colombo leaders was still hesitant about his proposal. So Ali proved his seriousness by sending formal invitations to 16 Asian and African countries, and also Ali Sastroamidjojo visited Nehru in New Delhi on 25 September 1954, and Nehru agreed to support the Asian African Conference. And Ali Sastroamidjojo also received support from UNU when he visited Burma on 28 September 1954. And to discuss the further preparations of Asian African Conference, Ali invited Colombo leaders to come to Bogor. And in Bogor conference, the 5 prime ministers talked about the agenda of the conference, about the participants, about the preparations and organizations of the forthcoming conference. So after the Bogor conference, Ali Sastroamidjojo succeeded in lobbying 24 countries to come to Bandung Conference. Indonesia also succeeded to prepare the logistic and infrastructures of the Bandung Conference less than 4 months. So I argue that Ali was the important person in preparing the infrastructure. That was not only limited in terms of preparing infrastructure and logistics, but also preparing the participants, organizations, concept, and aim of the conference. And my conclusion is to understand the story of Bandung, we should analyze deeply the developments of ideas of Ali Sastroamijoyo on Afro-Asian solidarity. And the second is Ali Sastroamijoyo ideas of Afro-Asian solidarity was not only influenced by this by the global events or Indonesian foreign policy, but also by his political experience and international diplomacy. And the third is Ali Sastroamijoyo not only initiated but also helped to build infrastructure of the Bandung Conference. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Pak Wildan. But before that, to introduce yourself, so please.
My name is Wildan Utama. My thesis in Leiden University about Bandung Conference, the history, the moment, and the legacy of the Bandung Conference. So this research is expanded from my thesis. I interest to explore deeply the contributions of Ali Sastroamijoyo in Bandung Conference. Yeah, I'm from Universitas Gadjah Mada in Jakarta.
Thank you, Pak Wildan. You have done very comprehensive presentations about the role of Ali Sastroamijoyo in building solidarity among the Asian and African countries. The next speaker is Ms. Naoko. She's going to talk about women performing diplomacy at the Bandung Conference of 1955. So, Ms. Shimizu, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. My name is Naoko Shimizu, and I'm Professor of History at Birkbeck, University of London. But as you can tell from my name, I'm Japanese, but one of those people who lived abroad all their lives. Now, what I'm going to talk about today consists of one part of a book I'm writing on the Bandung Conference of 1955. And the title that I have is called Diplomacy as Theatre, the Bandung Conference of 1955 and the Making of the Third World. So basically, I'm sort of working on this notional framework in order to understand the Bandung Conference in a new light. And I call this framework Diplomacy as Theatre. So within this framework, performing plays a central role, because my argument is that by privileging the performative aspect of diplomacy, then we gain some understanding of how diplomacy is perceived by the people. Because one of the things one could argue is that diplomacy, as we see and experience it through everyday life, is what constitutes the public face of diplomacy. So that's what I'm actually interested in, and I'm interested in diplomacy not primarily as a negotiating foreign policy analysis type of approach, but as a process that we experience in our daily lives. So, how did women perform in diplomacy at the Bandung Conference? And as we all know, diplomacy, generally speaking, is quite a male-dominated sphere. And in some sense, our Bandung Conference was no different from most other international diplomatic events in that women's role as diplomatic performers played marginal and limited in scope. Now, what I'm going to argue in this paper is that we need to expand generally the scope of intellectual inquiry pertaining to the study of diplomacy if we are serious about wanting to understand more fully how women were integrated into the iconographies of diplomacy at Bandung. So to this end, what I'm going to do is I'm going to explain two complementary dimensions of diplomacy. One is called formal diplomacy, and the other is called informal diplomacy. Now, under formal diplomacy, we question why women remained, on the whole, invisible in formal enactments of diplomacy, most notably in what I had previously termed the freedom of thought, and I'm going to explain this in a few minutes. Now, in informal diplomacy, however, we observe the diametrically opposite phenomenon, which is the constant visibility of women, particularly where we privilege visual or textual sources. So by including the people of Bandung as local audiences with a performative function in the theatre of diplomacy, women again become prominent. that I'm sure you've seen in quite a lot of photographic representations of the 1955 conference. And this is Sukarno walking towards, the last 50 to 100 meters towards Khudori, or the Freedom Building, mainly because of the concerns about traffic congestions around the Freedom Building. So everybody, absolutely everybody was made to walk in the last few meters. Okay, now this is one of the very famous photographs taken by a female American journalist, photographer, and so you see this. This is the Chinese community in Bandung, and what they are very excited about is actually Auyeung Lai. So they're saying, look, there's Joe, and there is there are a lot of photographs like this of all the leaders. This is Unu, the Burmese Prime Minister, and Nasser with Prince Faisal and the Yemeni head, and this is Muhammad Ali of Pakistan. Okay, so basically, the thing about this walk is that it created this interactive space between these statesmen, very famous world statesmen, and the local people, both sides performing their respective roles as statesmen and audience, lending to this kind of overall iconography of the Bandung Conference. And I argue that in this mutually reinforcing interaction, it resulted in the forging of a bond, often emotive, between leaders and the people based on shared revolutionary experiences of struggles of independence. Now, the Freedom Walk can be read in a critical, alternative way, and this is what I'm going to do in this particular paper. Because now we see a completely different version of how we can read this performance, Freedom Walk. And the thing about it is that one thing that's very striking about this walk is the conspicuous absence of women. And so apart from a handful of women that you saw who paraded alongside their men, the Freedom Walk for women ended up being about performing their invisibility in international diplomacy. Hence what one may call a non-performance as performance. They were simply not there, and the fact of that actually says quite a lot about this whole kind of diplomatic enactment. So who did we see in the photographs of the walk? Well, basically we saw Indira Gandhi here. She also walks in the walk with the father, and obviously her position as the daughter of Nehru, and she became his sort of like an official diplomatic consort since Nehru became Prime Minister in 1947. So you actually begin seeing her quite visibly in many of the diplomatic outings of Nehru. But the point is, she's not listed as an official delegate of the conference. So the Sri Lankan or Ceylonese newspaper called Ceylon Daily News said that it's the abysmal state of female representation at the conference, which is really sort of undermining part of the intention of the conference, because why wasn't there a single woman delegate represented in the 29 delegations which were representing 1.4 billion people of the world? Now, as you may remember from the very first walk where Sukarno and Mohammed Hatta were featured, they were accompanied by their wives, and so was Elisabeth by Iwasuri, his wife. Now, obviously, nothing greatly to Sukarno and Hatta, and basically Elisabeth and the Joint Secretariat who were organizing this, that wives of the Indonesian leaders, presidential party, actually were represented at this World Historic Conference. And there may be two messages behind this thing. One is actually an important political message to make of their revolutionary credentials in the eyes of the Indonesian public. And then, secondly, it could have been a diplomatic statement for representing Indonesia as a leading new modern state in the eyes of the global audience. Now, paradoxically, it was the paucity of women in the freedom walk that had the effect of highlighting contemporary feminist politics in some Asian societies, particularly the burning issue of polygamy, which had been practiced by two leaders amongst the colonial powers, the sponsoring states of the Bandung Conference. Now, polygamy was one of the two pressing and longest-standing issues in women's movement in Indonesia, dating back to the colonial period, and the other issue being women's education. So, small wonder then that the Pakistani Prime Minister Mohanty, who paraded along with Mohanty, to whom he had only gotten married some 2 weeks before the conference, got under fire from women's movements in Pakistan and Indonesia. Mohanty was the Prime Minister's second wife, and her presence at Bandung caused quite a stir and consternation for a number of reasons. A news headline screamed out, "Mrs. Ali number 2 is now in Bandung." The Pakistan Times published an article protest against Ali's second marriage, in which it reported a meeting of Pakistani women demanding of the boycott of second wives and their status, and that the status and the title of the First Lady should belong to Begum Hamid Mohammed Ali, who was his first wife. Now, in fact, this issue resulted in a protest march of Pakistani women to the Pakistani Prime Minister's residence, and an anti-polygamy letter was delivered by the group, the Protection of Rights of Women, which had been formed in Karachi the day before. The editorial took an uncompromising position, supporting the women's group that the second marriage of the Prime Minister had caused considerable damage to Pakistan's prestige abroad. Now, this issue was noted in the Ceylon Daily News, and also the Indonesian women's magazine Wanita also had written about it. And then finally, it reached the Home News Services Bulletin of the BBC, so it became global news. Now, polygamy was obviously was a national feminist issue that united various women's movements belonging to Christians, both Catholics and Protestants and Muslims, and also became a bone of contention as there existed a fundamental disagreement on the degree to which each side had wanted to push for either the complete ban of polygamy on the part of Christians or to better women's lot without abolishing the institution altogether on the part of Muslims. Now, what exacerbated this whole debate was Sukarno's position, because he had been an ardent supporter of women's movement in the period of nationalist struggle, encouraging all women to be part of the revolutionary struggle, only to be exposed that it was a lip service he had paid to have women join the struggle in attaining equality of Indonesians. Now, hence Sukarno was hypocritical in his stance, mainly because his revolutionary rhetoric and daily practice diverged considerably. And to make matters doubly worse, the social class most affected by problems of polygamy was the well-to-do class, only the top few percentage of the Indonesian population. So these were the women that participated in the revolutionary struggle most visibly, and paradoxically was their class that was most affected by polygamy. Now, Now, this is a very one of the very famous photographs of the 17th August 1945, with the proclamation of Indonesian independence made in a house in Wildan in the neighborhood of Jakarta. And you see Fatmawati, who is Sukarno's wife, with the head scarf on, facing her back is this way, and Madam Hatta next to her. So in effect, these two, first lady and the second lady of the Republic of Indonesia, were part of the revolutionary iconography. So this is why it was doubly important that Fatmawati was actually represented in Bandung, because it sort of, it was a legitimization of the revolutionary struggle and the independence and a new new country that was created. And Fatmawati was known as the mother of the country, or Ibu Negara. So anyway, so there's this highly symbolic element in the representation of Mrs. Sukarno at the conference. Now I'm going to move on to the next thing, which is about women in informal diplomacy. So as I have already stated above, women generally speaking are invisible from formal documentation of diplomatic activities. Yet, how do we account for the overwhelming visual evidence of women during the conference? So women are highly visible in a variety of conference activities, such as manning the information desks. Yes, you see quite a lot of women. If you start counting women, you will find out that there's quite a lot, considering how few there were on the Freedom Wall. Social events, they were there as journalists, entertainments, involved in entertainments, and most prominently as members of the local audience, as you already saw in some of the photographs before. Now, women, Nehru, Prime Minister Nehru of India, even noted the prominence of women at the Bandung Conference, and he actually thought that the Arab states delegates would be quite impressed by how women are actively involved in this conference. Now, so what I argue in this section is that women performed as agents of informal diplomacy during the conference. And also that we can argue for this kind of position if you include a lot of visual materials as sources, as part of sources to look at diplomacy, generally speaking. Now, there are a number of things that I talk about, which I simply do not have time, so I'm just going to say very briefly that the role of diplomatic consorts is very important. Now, these are diplomatic wives, generally speaking, because wives tend to be the accompanying partners more than husbands. And there are various ways in which they can be very helpful or useful in diplomacy, because diplomatic consorts can project visibly the national ethnic identity of their countries through the manipulation of the dress. And of course, the dress, or the study of the dress in informal non-verbal communication is quite an important part of this kind of symbols and meanings in politics and diplomacy. Now, what is important about the underlying agenda of these soft power activities, many of which were exercised by women as informal agents, was that it was primarily about the politics of inclusion. So in other words, it is not about staking out national differences through diplomatic consorts, although they do by the fact that they are wearing different national dresses. But what you notice is that it's very much about demonstrating the togetherness of these women representing different countries. So in other words, it plays a complementary and augmenting role to formal diplomacy, even when national delegates may be at odds with each other in committee meetings, yet in the informal diplomatic sphere, consorts' primary formative objective would be to emphasize friendship, show interest in other people's cultures, and express concern for the socially disadvantaged. So the most important aspect of this performance is the photographic evidence and portraying female sociability in inclusiveness. And one would almost say that you can almost read it as a female solidarity, as they jointly play a supportive role to their male counterparts. Now, there are some few more photographs. This is sorry. This is supposed to be the official reception on the opening day of the conference. Oh yeah, up there, sorry, in the book, in Darwis's edited volume. And so it's the equivalent of going to the governor of Jakarta's reception tonight. This was actually the West Javanese governor's residence, and Sukarno and the Colombo Pass lined up are hosting it. And in fact, you will actually see quite a lot of female consuls, diplomatic consuls' wives attending this event. And there were like special outings arranged on the Kartini Day. Kartini was probably the first famous Indonesian female feminist in the colonial times, days. And just going to show you this. This is the bulletin that some of you may know about. Yeah. Okay, so this bulletin has quite a lot of photographs, many of which include women. And one of the very interesting events organized was the tea party at the governor's residence, West Japanese governor's residence. And also there were fashion shows for which princesses from the courts of Jakarta and Surakarta they were modeling their princely clothes for this session. And so judging from the frequency of photographs featuring social occasions, featuring women in the official conference bulletin, for example, the Joint Secretariat of the conference must have considered informal diplomacy, which consisted in large parts of various activities promoting sociability amongst delegates, is integral to the overall success of the conference. So I'm going to conclude, because I'm probably running out of time, yeah? So what becomes clear in this attempt to understand the role of women in the study of international diplomacy at Bandung is that traditional diplomatic sources based on textual materials, mostly official archival materials, have a dearth of material on women's participation in diplomacy, mainly because of the perceived lack of women's involvement in policy-related issues. However, if one investigates a larger pool of sources which privilege visual materials, one begins to gain a different perspective on the role of women in diplomacy. So truth be told, women are prominent in visual representations at Bandung, making up a significant part of the iconography. So the range of sources consulted can have a direct bearing on the understanding of the role of women at Bandung. So therefore, the move to expand the range of sources to include the visual materials would be the first step in the direction towards a democratization of diplomacy that includes women. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much.
Very interesting insights, but we are out of time, so I just give the next opportunity to Mr. Jürgen Dinkel. He's going to present the Asian African Conference in Bandung 1955 and the rediscovery of the Third World by the Soviet Union and the flow is yours.
Thank you very much. I also would like to thank the organizers for inviting me in for this wonderful and stimulating conference. My name is Jürgen. I'm a lecturer and researcher at the University of East. And I'm happy to present a small part of my recently published PhD thesis on the history of the non-aligned movement, covering the period from the League Against Imperialism to Bandung, Belgrade, up to the 1990s. And as I'm the last one between you and the coffee break, I try to keep it short. But first, I want to quote Darwis in this recently published book, Bandung at 60. I quote, "There are other states that were also concerned in diverse degrees by the conference, such as France, the Netherlands, but also Russia, Portugal, Australia, South Africa, Israel, and I may add Germany. Yet we do not know how did those countries perceive, anticipate, or react to the conference." And that's my point. In my talk, I'd like to examine how the Asian African Conference in Bandung was perceived in East Germany and as well as in the Soviet Union, and how these countries reacted to the conference. As you know, neither the Soviet Union and the GDR nor the United States and its Western allies were invited to Bandung, but both blocs in the Cold War paid close attention to the conference preparations and proceedings. Journalists, diplomats, and politicians from the GDR and the Soviet Union reported intensively about the conference. the day before the opening of the Asian-African Conference in April 1955, the German journalist Herbert von Borch observed that, I quote, "For the first time in a decade, there is a decision of world importance in which neither the Russians nor the Americans are participating." And in May 1955, a few weeks after the conference, a leading German newspaper told its readers, I quote, "The Asian-African Conference demonstrated the independence of the new states more convincingly than all previously signed official documents, statutes, and constitutions." Quoted. The leading Soviet newspaper Pravda proclaims in January 1955 that the upcoming Bandung Conference would, I quote, "express the will of the peoples of Asia to decide their own fate and indicate the ever-growing struggle of the Asian peoples for full national independence against colonialism, racial discrimination, and economic enslavement." And a few days before the conference, Pravda told its readers, "The conference is not only the most important event in the life of the Asian and African countries, it is also important for the Soviet people, for international diplomacy, and for the whole world." Quote. These are only 4 out of thousands of comments, articles, and statements from journalists, diplomats, and governments who saw in the Bandung Conference a significant moment in 20th century international diplomacy. Newspapers from every corner of the globe reported on the conference, while diplomats and governments in every country discussed the results of the meeting. Some even compared the meeting with the French Revolution or the October Revolution. The Bandung Conference was a place where new elites from post-colonial countries attained representation and were integrated in the world community as legitimate governments. The conference furthermore provided a space for the creation of new group identities and the heatings such as Afro-Asian movement or the spirit of Bandung, and marked the beginning of a new era in international politics. And finally, I would like to stress that the question of power in international relations is also a question of prestige. It is only by drawing attention to these assumptions that the effects of the Bandung Conference can be adequately understood. The international press and the foreign service of all countries from the very beginning observed the conference preparations, the conference itself, and the criticism voiced at the meeting. And this criticism mattered because it threatened to undermine the legitimacy of a government and its politics. In the case of Great Britain and the United States, as well as the GDR and the Soviet Union, numerous comments highlighted the fear of these governments that the Bandung Conference would create problems for their own international political agenda. In their view, highly publicized denunciations aimed to influence the world opinion could damage their authority and become a liability in the ideological struggle of the Cold War. All governments tried therefore to avoid this public criticism, either by making concessions to the main conference allowance or by influencing the conference proceedings and reporting. In short, the Bandung Conference mattered. It affected the legitimacy of politicians, governments, and politics. And in this sense, the conference had manifest consequences for world politics. According to Minister Paudyal, the Bandung Conference was understood by the Soviet Union and the GDR as a challenge to wide European domination, and it also represented an opening for the communist world to create new allies and spheres of influence. For the Soviet Union and the GDR, the post-colonial world of nations was a diplomatic field that a world of empires was not. And secondly, competing with the West, the Eastern Bloc started its own struggle for the hearts and minds of the Bandung nations and developed new strategies of cultural diplomacy and development aid. In the case of the Soviet Union, Stalin had failed to formulate any coherent policy towards the Asian and African countries. From 1949 to 1954, the official Soviet position was that post-colonial states were ruled by reactionary pro-Western regimes. Some Soviet experts and diplomats wanted the Kremlin to support the new countries, but did not dare to speak against the official line. Shortly after the death of Stalin, the Bandung Conference gave the new arguments, and the Soviet foreign policy towards Africa and Asia changed. The culmination of Khrushchev's opening to the Third World in 1955 was the Bandung Conference, and his following 5-week, 3-nation tour of South Asia with Nikolai Bulgari. As a first Soviet leader, he visited India, Burma, and Afghanistan, and thereby shifted the focus of the Soviet foreign policy from Europe to the post-colonial regions. The 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in February 1956 marked the next step in this change. The Kremlin now officially supported anti-colonial and liberation movements. Soviet involvement in so-called anti-imperialistic struggles in Asia and Africa was not completely new, of course. The Soviet Union had already supported these movements under Lenin, in accordance with his dictum that the road to Paris leads through Peking and Calcutta. Khrushchev continued this tradition, but with more emphasis and vigor. The Soviet leadership was convinced that the focal point for the spread of revolution was now the emerging Third World. Therefore, the Soviet Union developed several strategies to influence the post-colonial elite. The Kremlin supported post-colonial states diplomatically, especially in the United Nations, and with military and economic aid. Ideologically, the Kremlin now justified wars of liberation. In addition, new political and scientific institutions were established to provide the Soviet leadership with information about the Third World. For example, the Institute for Countries of Asia and Africa was established in Moscow in 1956. Furthermore, cultural exchange programs and festivals were organized, like the World Festival of Youth with students in 1957, with participants from 131 countries. And last but not least, the University of Friendship in Moscow was founded in 1960 to demonstrate the friendship between the Soviet Union and the post-colonial countries. 4 years earlier, in July 1956, the Institute for Foreign Students opened at Karl Marx University in Leipzig. And in this direction, finally, the Soviet Union and the GDR faced the spirit of Bandung most directly at home. According to Julie Hessler, the early 1960s brought the first major influx of Africans into the Soviet Union for study, following the Central Committee's secret decree, which called for expanded cultural ties to Africa and the announcement of plans to open a new university for students from Africa, Asia, and Latin America. In the following months, the amount of students from these countries increased from merely 72 at the beginning of 1959 to over 500 by 1961 and to some 4,000 by the end of the decade. On a much smaller scale, the same development happened in the GDR. In 1960, Sheikh Magunga from Sierra Leone founded the Union of African Students and Workers in the GDR. And in the same year, the University of Leipzig hosted a conference of 250 students from Africa. Like the Soviet Union, the East German authorities preferred supervision and control of the public expressions of foreign students. In the GDR, responsibility for oversight and political mentorship of the national groups was given to the German African Society. But neither in the Soviet Union nor in the GDR, authorities succeeded in controlling foreign students. In both countries, foreign students protested in public against the racism, hostile behaviors, and violence they faced in Moscow or in Leipzig. In 1963, an Ethiopian student who left Moscow said that many African students referred to Friendship University in Moscow as Apartheid University, equating Soviet racism with South Africa's segregation policies. Through public demonstrations, articles in student magazines, and leaflets, the Asian and African students forced the daily racism in the Soviet Union and the GDR into official consciousness and pressured the authorities of the Soviet Union and the GDR to deal with racism in their own societies. To conclude, in my talk I have argued firstly that the press of the GDR and the Soviet Union reported intensively about the Asian-African Conference in Bandung. And secondly, this press coverage matters. Both countries perceived the Bandung Conference as an important international event. The Soviet Union recognized the conference participants after the conference as heads of state or government. The Kremlin changed its foreign policy towards post-colonial countries and developed shortly after Bandung several strategies to win the support of the new Third World countries. And in this direction, thirdly, the international and cultural relations between the Soviet Union and the GDR and the Asian African countries became closer. The communist states founded university or university institutions for the foreign students. And as a result of these education migrations, the Bandung world went from a distant geopolitical development to a live reality on the campuses and in the streets of the Soviet Union and East Germany. As it implies that decolonization was a global process with effects felt even in nations that were not part of the conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you. From the last speaker, we heard that the Bandung Conference has contributed to the international basis perspective, the context of state relations and also building of national identity. We have only 15 minutes probably because we started a bit late. So if we can close this session by 15:03. So we have around 20 minutes to discuss. And I will give to the floor maybe one from each row. So from the right of my hand, the middle. Okay? Two of you were too many. We have 5. Okay, all of you. So, but please do it in short and concise. Please, just start from you. Please mention your name and where are you going to address the question or the comment. Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you for all the presentations. My name is Makam and I'm from Palestine, based in the UK. The year 1956 was mentioned around 16 times, I think, in this panel. Bandung Conference was held in 1955, whereas 1956 was crucial. And of course, the last speaker mentioned this many times. However, could I just throw one very important historical factor? In 1956, France, England, and Israel attacked, or in what was called or was branded as the Suez War, Egypt, and in particular President Nasser, who was present in Bandung. Any particular idea whether it was part of the reaction or something connected to this? Thank you.
Who are you going to address the questions? Is it two? Okay, thank you. The next one, yeah.
Yes. First of all, I think, thank you. My name is Johanna. I agree with what you that 1956 was the turning point. And I personally think that it's probably related to Nasser growing out of the way from under. But anyway, my question was about the Afro-Asian Solidarity Committee and its history and what happened. It's called APSO, and I don't know whether anybody is represented here. And there was a very interesting event in Cyprus when an Egyptian delegate was killed during such conference because he was sent by Sena. And I think such anecdote or important events reflect how the Bandung spirit died in Egypt because since Nasser left and died and Sena took over, there was a very important change, among which the incident of Cyprus is one of the representatives of Sadat was with the captive accord, and there was a lot of problems in the Middle East. This is one point. Anybody has anything to say about that? historical diplomatic event like Bandung to talk about the inner politics or behind the scenes, what's happening, whether in terms of the representation of women or even the representation of political parties and the conflicts that we have in local politics, like the question of Egypt and which I read on the paper. So it's behind the scenes of politics. It's very important. Very complex. Those who know about that. Because I know historically, President, he was behind also the organizers of the conference. And my question also is people who Colombo find. Can you repeat exactly who the Colombo find were? Thank you.
Thank you. The next one. Yes, please. Just three of you. Okay.
My name is Lee Kiu Chi from Hong Kong, and my question is whether there was any planned second conference after Bandung 1955, and that it didn't happen, and then why? What happened that it didn't happen?
Sorry, it's not.
Was there any planned second conference after Bandung 1955, and that it didn't happen? Then what were the reasons?
Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you. I'm Mohanty from India. And my question is to Ms. Naoko. It's an excellent paper that presents up women in Bandung Conference. But I wonder whether they really democratize the space substantively, with the substance, or they were present by default, that they were the wives or sisters or daughters of all these big leaders, and by default they came and they had a fashion show. They did some indirect diplomacy, no doubt, but at that time, if we know the leaders like Nehru and Mahatma Gandhi, they didn't raise the vital questions regarding women's issues. So I don't know whether they really democratized space. Maybe participation-wise there were many women, but substantively did they contribute? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you for the time. My name is Auyeung Lai Seung. I'm the principal of Project Architecture, and currently I'm doing opening summer research in the MIT and in the USA. And I would not really like to pose a question, a particular question. I just like to express a notion, because I've been learning so much in the past few hours or so. I would like to quote what Dr. Darwis had said, and was written in the book too. The new Asia and Africa, as shown in Bandung, is not taking the identical shape of a new Europe or a new America. And this is very interesting. And for me, in a sense, it's quite sad, because I haven't seen much young people involved in this kind of conference, because as we speak, because what we really want is that a Bandung spirit, not only as a memory, but also a way to redefine ourselves as Asia and African, because what we have now is, after 60 years of the Bandung spirit, I think pretty much we're still doing the way of life of the Americans and Europe, and nothing really changed much. And maybe in the next 40 years, 100 years of Bandung spirit, then we will have another missing link in the history. I think that's all.
I will try to open the second round. So
Thank you very much for all these questions, very important. I will get quickly from Makrab, Bandung and Suez War. By chance, my PhD thesis is on the history of Suez Canal. So I know this war of Suez and the attack by tripartite attack. But as far as the books I studied concerned, there is no one mention of this war, Suez War. But of course, I know that Sukarno, during one of his speech after the Suez War, of course, he denounced the war and he supported Nasser. And before Nasser launched the nationalization, he checked the network of his friends. How is Sukarno about this? How is Nehru about this? Before he decided to launch this nationalization. Yeah. But in the books I mentioned, there's no one who spoke about this war. It's okay? APSO. Yes, very interesting because there are some Nepalese delegates here are members of APSO. And one of the Nepalese delegate will present the history of APSO and its development. So I think you speak about Yusuf al-Sebahi, who was assassinated in Greece. Second Bandung, Lautinci. This is a very important question. Well, there was a project of Second Bandung in Algiers, supposed to be in 1965. But circumstances is not favorable. Indonesia, there was Sukarno was overthrown. In Algeria as well, Ben Bella was also overthrown by Boumediene, and so that finally it was cancelled, and it never happened. The second Bandung. There was a project of second Bandung, but it was cancelled. So this is the end of the Bandung Conference, the series of Bandung Conference. Just a comment for Eka Swadiansa. Yes, this is very. That's why I mentioned. Although Carlos Romulo is pro-American, but he was very critical towards America, and I think his statement is still very relevant. Do we will follow the way of America and Europe? This is still, I think, still very, very relevant question. Okay.
So actually, there is no questions that is pointed to me, but I will answer the questions number 3 about any plan to second Bandung. So actually, there is a plan to hold second Bandung in Algeria in 1965, but the plan was impossible because 3 reasons. First, because the conflicts of India and China borders. So India moved to Soviet side, and China more closer to Indonesia. China support Indonesia in the confrontations to Malaysia. And the second is because the competitions between Belgrade Conference and the Bandung Conference. Now, after Belgrade was success to be held in Belgrade, there is competitions between Belgrade and Bandung. So Nehru was more concerns to support the Belgrade Conference, and also Nasser closer to Tito to support the Belgrade Conference. And also Sukarno changed its political visions. He more concerns to build the new revolutionary movements, NEFOS. And after that, there is a competition between Bandung and Belgrade. And also there is two visions between Bandung and Belgrade. So behind Bandung there is anti-colonialism mindset, and between Belgrade there is maintaining world peace concept. And the third is the most important thing, I think, because the changing situations in the Asian and African countries itself. So in 1965, we know that in Indonesia there is a coup, and Sukarno was overthrown by Suharto. And also in Algeria there is a coup, and it's impossible to hold the conference in Algeria. And also after 1965, there was some coup in Ghana, and also Nehru also died in 1964, if I'm not mistaken. So it's impossible after Indonesia, Algeria, and some of third world leaders was collapsed because the coup.
First of all, the colonial powers who were the sponsoring nations of the Bandung Conference were obviously Indonesia as the local host, India, Pakistan, Ceylon, and Burma. And basically, the initial idea was to split the cost between these five powers, although Indonesia obviously being the local host. Probably, I would imagine, probably ended up spending more than. And there were quite a lot of other cooperation, like, what are you going to do with the number of translators, interpreters, stenographers, and there are diplomatic correspondences relating to these things in the National Archives of India in New Delhi. Now, the thing about, I think I'd just like to say something about, for example, Carlos Romulo, who was the Filipino representative. And before he went, he was really written up as though he was the US stooge. And so Romulo and Thailand's Prince Waitanayakon were seen to be the pro-Western allies, and two of the key pro-Western countries, as well as some of the countries in the Middle East and Japan. But what was very interesting is if you look at this idea of, what is sort of front stage and what is behind this scenes diplomacy, then you can see this kind of gradual kind of forging of Afro-Asian identity, collective identity, based on this sort of like solidarity, understanding that they were there to make this conference work, comes out quite strongly, particularly towards the end. And so Carlos Romulo, for example, says to, I can't remember who the other statesman was, but he says, well, even when they had massive disagreements, like for example, when Sir John Potewala of Sri Lanka made this kind of almost like a crisis breaking up statement on communism. Carlos Romulo said that don't worry, we're going to make this conference work, so we're not going to break up over this. So there are instances like this that, in spite of the kind of veneer of pro-Western stance taken by some of these countries officially, underneath they actually understood what the intention of the conference was, and they weren't going to be the one to break this up. So I think that's a very important point to mention in the light of the Afro-Asian conference. And then secondly, about this women question that I received from you. Did it really make any difference? I think the immediate kind of response you get, i.e. contemporary responses from 1955, is that it was seen as a moment of disillusionment, because all these promises made in the kind of nationalist struggle for independence about women also becoming independent in many different ways, did not really materialize fully, maybe because once post-revolutionary state building begins, then all these kind of idealistic talk about equality of everyone and all these nice things which are going to be created in the newly independent state doesn't quite happen, because it reverts back to the status quo of kind of basically male dominated societies. So I think so. This issue about first ladies, I think was sort of symptomatic of this kind of disillusionment felt. But on the other hand, one can also argue that the Asian African Conference did lead to the creation of Afro-Asian Asian African Women's Conference, and also that this kind of forum is an important forum in terms of bringing to the fore the networks that exist or that can be fostered as a result of this kind of meeting. So international women's networks of various kinds, like not just socialist women's networks, but also other types of women's networks. So if you look at it from the international women's network history, then in fact, it wasn't the moment of disillusionment. So I think it depends on what perspective you take on this issue.
I would like to add one point in the question why no second Bandung conference took place. And I think it's very important to remember that the Bandung Conference, but also the first conference of non-aligned states in Belgrade in 1961, was the Tricontinental Conference in Havana in 1966, were gatherings outside of the United Nations. So in a way, all these conferences were competing with the United Nations. But for many governments and also for the governments of the Bandung states, the United Nations organization was also an attractive place to put forward their own national interests. And in 1964, the first United Nations Conference on Trade and Development took place in Geneva. And a group of 77 was founded, so a group of developing countries and many governments of the south and of the north. They were expecting that these conferences inside the United Nations would solve world economic problems. So 1 year later, many governments of the Bandung states thought maybe it's better to discuss our economic issues inside these UNCTAD conferences than in a Bandung conference. That maybe is one point that also is important for the question why there was no second Bandung conference.
Yeah, just 30 seconds. The paper of Naoko and of myself are included in this book. And you can buy, I think, behind the seat, you have the books. This is the publication of our conference, Bandung+60, New Insights and Emerging Forces. Thank you.
I'm sorry for you who do not have time to comment or questions, but I believe we can just go directly to the speakers during the coffee break. So I just want to thank to all the speakers and to all of you, and let us give big applause to all of us.